The scent of yeast and flour had become Sister Margareta's morning prayer, rising with the dawn through the narrow windows of the chapel kitchen. Her hands, weathered and precise, kneaded dough with the same rhythm she had known for nearly 15 years within these stone walls, each motion a meditation, each loaf a small offering of sustenance. Beyond the convent's iron gates, West Berlin stirred to life under grey autumn skies. But here in the Benedictine sanctuary, time moved differently, measured in vespers and matins rather than the frantic pulse of a divided city. The wall stood just 3 blocks north, a fresh concrete scar that had appeared only months earlier, splitting families and futures with brutal efficiency. Sister Margareta never spoke of what she had seen the night they raised it, the searchlights piercing the darkness, the desperate voices calling across the newly forbidden distance. Some secrets belonged to God alone, she told herself, though her eyes sometimes betrayed a deeper knowing, a shadow of something the other sisters could never quite name. The kitchen became her kingdom each morning before the others woke, when she could work in silence and remember who she had been before taking her vows. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, shaping each loaf, checking the ovens, preparing the simple meals that sustained their small community of 12. The delivery had arrived earlier than usual today, stacked wooden crates of flour and salt from their regular supplier, a gruff man named Otto, who never met her eyes. She noticed everything, though she pretended not to, the way his hands trembled slightly, how he glanced toward the street before departing, the faint smell of cigarette, smoke that didn't match his usual brand. Prayer bells echoed through the corridors as dawn broke fully over the city, calling the sisters to their first devotions. Sister Margareta wiped flour from her hands and removed her apron with deliberate care, hanging it on the same brass hook she had used for countless mornings. The chapel waited, candles already flickering in the half-light, but her mind remained in the kitchen, circling back to Otto's nervous departure and the unusual weight of this morning's delivery. Something had shifted in the careful balance of her quiet world, a disturbance she couldn't yet name, but recognized with the instinct of someone who had once survived by trusting. Such intuitions. She took her place among the other nuns, her lips moving through familiar Latin prayers while her thoughts calculated distances, patterns, and possibilities. The wall had changed everything, turning West Berlin into an island of Western democracy surrounded by Soviet territory, and convents made convenient waypoints for those seeking to cross between worlds. Sister Margareta folded her hands and bowed her head, her expression serene as candlelight, revealing nothing of the questions multiplying behind her steady gaze. They arrived on a Tuesday evening, 3 days after the unusual delivery, appearing at the convent gates as twilight settled over the city like ash. 2 men and a woman, their clothes worn but recently cleaned, speaking German with accents that Sister Margareta immediately recognized as practiced rather than natural. Mother Superior welcomed them with characteristic warmth, offering sanctuary as the Benedictine tradition demanded, while Sister Margareta stood in the shadows of the entrance hall, observing how the younger man's eyes mapped the corridors with military precision. His companion kept touching her left wrist, a nervous gesture that revealed the pale outline where a watch had recently been removed, and refugees fleeing with nothing didn't worry about tan lines from expensive timepieces. During evening prayers, Sister Margareta positioned herself where she could watch them without seeming to watch. The woman knew when to kneel and when to stand, moving through the liturgy with rehearsed accuracy, but her lips never quite matched the Latin words the other sisters murmured. The older man held his rosary incorrectly, threading the beads through his fingers in a pattern no Catholic would use, while his eyes remained alert, scanning the chapel's alcoves and doorways. Sister Margareta felt the old instincts awakening, the same heightened awareness that had kept her alive in occupied Warsaw, when every stranger might be Gestapo, and every shadow concealed either salvation or betrayal. These people weren't refugees, they were scouts, and the convent had become a waypoint for something far more dangerous than desperate families seeking freedom. She maintained her expression of serene devotion, while her mind catalogued every detail: the faint chemical smell clinging to the younger man's jacket, the way the woman's shoes showed no wear despite claims of walking through forests, how all three carried themselves with the controlled tension of people accustomed to violence. After prayers ended, Mother Superior assigned them to the guest quarters, asking Sister Margareta to prepare a simple meal. In the kitchen, her hands moved through familiar motions while her thoughts raced through darker calculations. The microfilm hidden in the bread, these false refugees appearing days later, Otto's trembling hands, it formed a pattern she recognized from another war, another occupation. Sister Margareta ladled soup into plain bowls, her face calm as candlelight, revealing nothing of the cold certainty settling in her chest. The wall had made her sanctuary into a hunting ground, and she would need to remember skills she had spent 15 years trying to forget. Prayers alone wouldn't protect her sisters from what was coming through their gates, disguised as mercy. The discovery came 3 mornings later, during the pre-dawn hour when Sister Margareta began preparations for the day's meals. Her hands, moving through rituals older than memory itself. Otto had delivered the weekly bread before first light as always, leaving 6 dark rye loaves in the wooden crate by the kitchen door, but one loaf felt wrong in her palm, its weight distributed unevenly like a body concealing a weapon. She worked alone in the blue darkness, the only sounds her breathing and the distant rumble of military vehicles patrolling beyond the wall. That monstrous scar dividing the city into territories of suspicion and fear. Her fingers found the irregularity immediately, a small, hard cylinder embedded in the loaf's dense center, placed there with surgical precision during baking when the dough would seal, around foreign objects without trace. Sister Margareta's pulse remained steady as she extracted the capsule with a paring knife, her wartime training reasserting itself despite 15 years of peaceful routine among prayer books and soup kettles. The microfilm container was Soviet standard issue. She recognized the design from intelligence briefings in Warsaw when such objects meant the difference between resistance cells surviving or burning under interrogation lights. She held it to the dim kitchen window where dawn was breaking grey and cold over the divided city, understanding immediately that Otto's bread route, serving a dozen convents and churches across West Berlin, represented a perfect distribution network for intelligence operations. The capsule contained photographed documents, reduced to pinpoint size, probably diplomatic cables or military assessments, passing from embedded Soviet agents to handlers in the East, using holy spaces and charitable deliveries as camouflage against Western counterintelligence. Sweeps. Her hands trembled slightly as she hid the capsule in her apron pocket. Not from fear, but from the terrible clarity of recognition. Otto was either coerced or complicit, and the false refugees weren't scouts, but collectors, waiting to retrieve intelligence packages hidden in daily bread deliveries. The convent had become an unwitting dead drop, its sanctity weaponized by people who understood that nuns asking few questions and offering unconditional shelter made ideal unwitting accomplices in espionage networks spanning the wall's shadow. Sister Margareta thought of Mother Superior's trusting face, of her sisters sleeping peacefully in cells above, innocent women whose devotion to mercy was being systematically exploited by men playing lethal games with ideologies and borders. She returned the compromised loaf to its crate, leaving no sign of her discovery, while her mind already worked through options learned in occupied territory, when survival required thinking 3 moves ahead of enemies who controlled everything except your will to resist. The nightmare returned to Sister Margareta as she knelt in the empty chapel that morning, her rosary beads clicking softly while memory dragged her backward through time to Warsaw in 1943. When she had been Christina Wojcik, and survival meant learning to read lies in human faces. She had been 22 years. old working as a stenographer in the German administrative offices by day while photographing documents for the Polish Home Army by night, her fingers steady on a miniature camera while officers drank schnapps 3 rooms away. The Gestapo had arrested her on a Tuesday morning in March, dragging her from her boarding house while neighbors watched. Through curtained windows, too terrified to speak or remember her name aloud. The interrogation room had smelled of bleach and cigarette smoke, its walls painted institutional green that turned human skin the color of corpses under fluorescent lights that never dimmed. They had questioned her for 6 days, using methods that left no visible marks, but made sleep impossible, made breathing hurt, made her understand that her body was no longer hers to command or protect. On the 7th day, a different officer had entered, speaking Polish with a Krakow accent, offering her a glass of clean water and a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. She could continue resisting and die anonymously in Pawiak prison, or she could work for British intelligence, using her access to German offices to feed information through networks that spiraled across occupied Europe like underground rivers. She had chosen survival, and for 2 more years she played the obedient stenographer while memorizing troop movements, copying fuel depot locations, identifying collaborators whose names appeared on execution lists compiled in London. The British had extracted her through Czechoslovakia in April 1945, just ahead of Soviet forces whose liberation brought new forms of imprisonment to Poland's exhausted streets. They had given her a new identity, seminary education, and eventual emplacement in West Berlin, where her language skills and invisible past made her valuable for monitoring refugee movements across the hardening ideological divide. Now that training crystallized around her like ice forming on winter glass, every lesson learned in occupied territory suddenly relevant again as she faced the microfilm capsule hidden in her apron. She understood surveillance protocols, dead drop mechanics, the patient methodology of intelligence networks that operated in shadows between prayers and bread deliveries. Sister Margareta rose from her knees, her decision already made, knowing that some wars never truly ended, but only changed their uniforms and battlefield coordinates. Sister Margareta began her operation 3 days after discovering the microfilm, starting with the Thursday evening supper preparation when golden autumn light filtered through the kitchen's high windows and transformed ordinary flour dust into suspended constellations. She worked alone that afternoon, her hands moving through familiar rhythms of kneading and shaping, while her mind calculated angles and possibilities with the cold precision her British handlers had trained into her 2 decades earlier. The bread she prepared would feed 18 souls that evening, including the 4 supposed refugees who lingered too long in doorways, whose eyes tracked movement with professional assessment rather than grateful relief, whose German carried pronunciation patterns she recognized from intelligence briefings about Soviet training academies. Her marking system emerged from necessity and simplicity, designed to be invisible to casual observation, yet readable to trained operatives who understood the language of deliberate imperfection. She scored certain loaves with 3 shallow cuts instead of the traditional 2, placed others crust side down on cooling racks where protocol demanded they rest upward, dusted specific portions with extra flour in patterns that mimicked carelessness but actually indicated surveillance priority levels. Each modification corresponded to observations she had catalogued during evening prayers and morning services, noting which visitors whispered during consecration, whose hands moved to coat pockets when conversations shifted toward border-crossing stories, who watched the other nuns with assessment rather than devotion in their supposedly exhausted faces. The first test came during supper itself, when she served bread directly to each person seated at the refectory's long oak table, its surface worn smooth by centuries of communal meals and whispered conversations. She placed a triple-scored loaf before the man who called himself Peter Hoffman, watching through lowered eyes as he accepted it with hands that bore. Calluses in wrong places for his claimed profession as a schoolteacher, his fingers thick and capable in ways that suggested military training rather than chalk and textbooks. Across the table, the woman named Greta touched her rosary with uncertain fingers, holding the beads like foreign objects rather than familiar comfort, her lips moving. Silently through prayers whose words she clearly didn't know, despite claiming childhood in a Catholic village. Sister Margareta returned to the kitchen afterward, her heart beating steady and cold, while she recorded observations in a prayer journal whose margins contained a different kind of devotion entirely. She had marked 7 individuals that evening, creating an invisible map that would expand across subsequent weeks into a network diagram measuring the full scope of infiltration flowing through the convent's charitable threshold. The war she thought she'd escaped in 1945 had found her again, and this time she would fight it with flour and faith and the patient. Documentation that transformed bread into weaponized intelligence. The confession booth became her dead drop, that ancient wooden compartment where sins transformed into whispered secrets, and salvation arrived through carved screens that obscured faces, while amplifying voices into disembodied confessions. Sister Margareta entered it each afternoon, following Vespers, kneeling in the penitent's chamber with her rosary threaded through fingers that trembled not from fear, but from the weight of information she carried like stones in her pockets. Father Klaus arrived punctually each week, his footsteps echoing through the empty chapel with rhythms she had learned to recognize, though she knew. The man behind the screen worked for Western intelligence rather than divine providence, his clerical collar concealing radio equipment and his breviary containing cipher keys that transformed her observations into actionable operations. She spoke in the language of confession, reciting supposed transgressions that actually conveyed intelligence, about the operatives moving through the convent like shadows through candlelight. I have been troubled by pride, Father, counting 7 new souls this week, when I should simply welcome all equally, she murmured, her voice steady, despite knowing that listeners might hide in the chapel's dark corners, that microphones could transform prayer into evidence, that discovery meant consequences she remembered too well from occupation years that still woke her gasping in pre-dawn darkness. The priest responded with absolutions that contained instructions, his penance assignments indicating meeting schedules and priority targets, their conversation flowing in rhythms indistinguishable from genuine spiritual counsel to anyone lacking the code book that turned devotion into espionage. The supply closet behind the sacristy provided another channel, its shelves lined with communion wafers and candle wax and cleaning supplies that smelled of lemon oil and institutional purpose. Sister Margareta began hiding her bread distribution charts inside, hollowed prayer books, their pages carefully excised to create compartments that held folded papers marked with her distinctive notation system, each symbol representing an operative she had catalogued through patient observation and methodical documentation. She left them wrapped in altar cloths on predetermined schedules, retrieving replacement. Volumes that contained questions from her handlers, equipment for the invisible ink she mixed from kitchen chemicals, photographs of suspected agents for her to identify during evening meals when faces relaxed into unguarded expressions. The tension mounted like pressure behind her sternum, that constant awareness of walking through minefields, disguised as holy ground, where every conversation carried double meanings and silence itself became a form of communication. Sister Margareta maintained her routines with mechanical precision, kneading bread while calculating odds, leading prayers while counting faces. Her life split between the nun she appeared and the operative she remained, knowing that discovery would mean not just her death, but the collapse of an intelligence network, measuring the full scope of Soviet infiltration into the West's vulnerable heart. The cataloguing became her obsession and her discipline, transforming Sister Margaretta's existence into a methodical dance between devotion and documentation that consumed her waking hours and invaded her restless dreams. She maintained leather-bound notebooks disguised as prayer journals, their pages filled with what appeared to be spiritual reflections but actually contained detailed observations written in Polish shorthand she had learned during resistance years, each entry describing physical characteristics and behavioral patterns of the operatives flowing through the convent like dark water through ancient pipes. 28 faces burned themselves into her memory through repetition and study. 28 sets of habits and mannerisms she tracked across weeks of careful observation, noting who touched their left ear when nervous, who avoided eye contact during evening prayers, whose German carried slight inflections suggesting Moscow training rather than authentic regional dialects. The bread distribution system evolved into her mapping technique, each marked loaf serving as a tracer element in the network. She was slowly illuminating like constellations emerging through clearing fog. She used different scoring patterns on the crusts, subtle variations invisible to casual observers, but meaningful to her trained eyes, assigning each operative a unique identifier that appeared in her charts as geometric symbols rather than names or faces that could condemn if discovered. When Operative 7 met with Operative 15 in the courtyard after Compline, sharing cigarettes beneath the linden tree, whose branches scraped against ancient stone walls, she noted the connection with intersecting lines on her hidden maps, building relationship webs that revealed the network's architecture through patient accumulation of seemingly innocent interactions. The chapel became her observation post during the dangerous middle weeks when Soviet handlers grew suspicious of supply inconsistencies and began watching the convent with heightened scrutiny that Sister Margareta felt like cold breath against her neck. She positioned herself at the kitchen's narrow window during bread distribution, memorizing which operatives selected which loaves, tracking the marked bread through subsequent days to identify safe houses and communication chains extending across West Berlin's divided geography. Her hands worked automatically through familiar tasks, while her mind calculated angles and probabilities, weighing risks against intelligence value, knowing that each additional day of operation brought both greater understanding and increased danger of discovery that would end everything in basement interrogation rooms she remembered too clearly from occupation darkness. The weight of those 28 lives pressed against her conscience during sleepless hours when she knelt before the altar in midnight, silence, praying for forgiveness for the deceptions she practiced and the trap she was carefully constructing around human beings who perhaps believed themselves patriots serving righteous causes in ideological wars beyond her theological comprehension. Yet she continued her work with unwavering determination born from memory of previous tyrannies, her bread and her prayers becoming weapons in conflicts fought through shadows and whispers, through marked loaves and coded confessions, through the quiet courage of a woman who had chosen long ago that some battles demanded participation, regardless of the vestments one wore or the vows one had spoken before altars that witnessed both salvation and necessary sins committed in freedom's complicated service. The storm came on a Thursday evening when autumn rain hammered against the chapel's leaded windows like urgent fists seeking sanctuary, the sound masking the heavier footsteps that approached through the convent's outer courtyard, where wet cobblestones reflected scattered lamplight in broken golden fragments. Sister Margareta was arranging bread baskets for evening supper when she heard the main doors crash open with violence that sent echo shocks through stone corridors, followed by guttural commands in German spoken with Moscow edges that cut through the peaceful murmur of nuns preparing tables with white linen and simple wooden bowls. Her hands froze above the marked loaves for one dangerous heartbeat before training reasserted itself, her fingers moving with deliberate casualness to redistribute the scored bread among unmarked companions, burying evidence in plain sight, while her pulse hammered against her throat like a trapped bird beating wings. Against cage bars. Through the kitchen doorway, she glimpsed dark overcoats and hard faces scanning the chapel with predatory focus, their eyes cataloguing exits and occupants with professional efficiency that confirmed her worst calculations had manifested into immediate present danger, requiring absolute composure. She wasn't certain her trembling hands could maintain. The ranking officer demanded to inspect supply records and convent registers in harsh tones that shattered the evening's contemplative atmosphere like rifle shots through morning fog, his presence radiating authoritarian menace that made the younger nuns step backward instinctively, while Mother Superior advanced with dignified calm that betrayed no awareness of the intelligence operation unfolding beneath her spiritual leadership. Sister Margareta forced herself to continue supper preparations with methodical precision, slicing dark bread with steady knife strokes, while mentally reviewing which notebooks remained hidden in the flour bins, which maps were concealed between prayer book pages in her cell, calculating exposure vectors and containment strategies with the portion of her mind not occupied with maintaining her unremarkable domestic performance. The other nuns moved around her in their established routines, unknowingly providing the perfect alibi through their genuine ignorance, their innocent conversations about tomorrow's mass readings and the leaking chapel roof, creating authentic background noise against which her deceptions could hide like clever forgeries among legitimate documents. Sister Margareta felt sweat gathering beneath her wimple despite the evening's chill, tasted copper fear on her tongue, but her hands never wavered as she arranged bread portions on wooden platters, each movement declaring through physical testimony that she was merely what she appeared, a simple woman of God whose greatest concerns involved yeast and prayers rather than espionage networks and geopolitical chess games. The inspection stretched across agonizing minutes that felt like hours suspended in amber, the officers moving through sacred spaces with contaminating disregard, while Sister Margareta maintained her position at the serving table, distributing bread to nuns who filed past with bowed heads and folded hands, their prayer postures inadvertently shielding her from sustained observation. When the ranking officer finally questioned her directly about supply deliveries and unusual visitors, she responded in simple German with appropriate deference, explaining bread orders and flour shipments with such mundane thoroughness that his interest visibly waned beneath the crushing tedium of domestic logistics presented by an apparently simple-minded nun whose concerns ended at kitchen thresholds. Her performance was flawless because it contained truth wrapped around deception like prayer shawls concealing weapons, her genuine piety providing perfect camouflage for skills learned in darker times, her authentic devotion making the espionage beneath it invisible to eyes trained to recognize fear but blind to the particular courage required to show none. The officers departed as suddenly as they had arrived, leaving disrupted silence and lingering menace like cigarette smoke in closed rooms, and Sister Margareta finally allowed herself one shaking breath before resuming her evening duties, with hands that steadied only through supreme effort of will, that left her exhausted beyond any physical labor's capacity to produce. The coordinated operation unfolded across West Berlin on a fog-shrouded November morning when church bells rang 6 times through grey air, thick with moisture that clung to everything like cold fingers. 28 separate arrest teams moving simultaneously toward addresses, scattered throughout the American, British and French sectors with military precision choreographed from Sister Margareta's bread-marked intelligence maps. In an apartment near Kurfürstendamm, agents surrounded a supposed textile merchant whose basement contained radio equipment sophisticated enough to reach Moscow, while in Charlottenburg a cultural attaché found himself blocked by unmarked vehicles as he descended steps toward his morning constitutional, his diplomatic immunity meaningless against evidence documenting years of illegal intelligence activities. The operations proceeded with quiet efficiency, characteristic of Western intelligence cooperation at its finest. Each arrest, team executing warrants simultaneously to prevent warnings cascading through the network like dominoes falling in predetermined sequences. The element of surprise maintained absolutely, despite the operation's massive scope and coordination requirements across multiple agencies and national jurisdictions. Sister Margareta learned of the raid's success 3 days later when Father Klaus arrived for scheduled confession hours. His presence in the confessional booth marking the first communication since that terrible Thursday inspection when KGB officers had nearly uncovered everything she had built through months of patient observation and careful documentation. Through the wooden screen, his voice carried controlled satisfaction as he confirmed that every target had been secured, that her intelligence maps, drawn on bread distribution ledgers, had proven flawlessly accurate, that the entire Soviet intelligence apparatus in West Berlin had been effectively decapitated through her work and courage, beyond any reasonable expectation for someone operating alone in such dangerous circumstances. She listened with bowed head and folded hands, her rosary beads cool against her fingers, feeling relief wash through her body like warm water, dissolving tension she had carried so long it had become part of her physical structure, the weight of responsibility finally lifting from shoulders that had borne it without complaint, but not without cost, measured in sleepless nights and constant vigilance. The other nuns noticed nothing unusual about Sister Margareta in subsequent weeks, as convent life returned to its peaceful rhythms of prayer and service, though Mother Superior occasionally observed her with thoughtful regard, that suggested intuitions beyond what could be spoken within their cloistered world of spiritual devotion. The bread deliveries continued from a new supplier after the previous company mysteriously closed, its proprietor having disappeared into interrogation rooms where patient questioning extracted confessions about courier networks and dead drop, locations that further dismantled Soviet operations throughout Central Europe. Sister Margareta maintained her duties with the same quiet efficiency she had always demonstrated, managing the chapel kitchen with humble competence that concealed the extraordinary achievement she could never claim publicly, her contribution to Western security remaining classified under protocols that would outlast her natural lifetime by decades. In classified files stored in temperature-controlled archives in Polish and Langley, her operation would eventually be designated as one of the most successful single-agent penetrations of Soviet intelligence during the Cold War's most dangerous years, though her name appeared only as coded designations in documents few would ever read. Sister Margareta's hands trembled slightly as she sliced bread for morning distribution on a grey February morning in 1987, the arthritis that had claimed her fingers over recent years, making simple tasks require concentration that would have seemed impossible during her vigorous middle decades when she had operated against Soviet intelligence with steady nerve and unfailing precision. The other nuns attributed her occasional distant expressions to advancing age and the natural contemplation that came with approaching the end of earthly service, unaware that behind her pale blue eyes she sometimes revisited those dangerous months when the convent had been ground zero for espionage operations that had altered the Cold War's trajectory in ways the world would never fully comprehend. She spoke little during communal prayers now, her voice soft and sometimes breathless, the pneumonia that had settled into her lungs that winter, refusing to clear despite medical attention and the devoted care of sisters who had shared decades of peaceful devotion without knowing the warrior who had walked among them disguised in humble service. When Father Klaus visited for her final confession in late February, his face aged but still recognizable despite 26 years having passed. Since those desperate November days, she smiled with understanding that transcended words, their shared history, requiring no verbal acknowledgement in those sacred moments before her departure from a world she had helped protect through invisible sacrifice. The small funeral attended by 17 nuns and a handful of local parishioners revealed nothing of Sister Margareta's true significance, her passing marked by simple ceremony befitting a woman who had lived apparently unremarkable existence, devoted to prayer and kitchen management within cloistered walls, far from historical events that shaped nations. Among the mourners stood a silver-haired man in conservative dark suit who signed the condolence book with illegible scrawl and departed immediately after the burial, his presence noted by no one except Mother Superior, who had developed over decades the wisdom to recognize significance in carefully maintained anonymity. In classified briefing rooms across Western capitals, intelligence officers who had built careers on foundations she had laid marked her passing with moments of silent acknowledgement, her coded designation finally attached to a real name, in files that would remain sealed until the 21st century brought declassification protocols and historical reassessment. The small wooden cross marking her grave in the convent cemetery bore only her name, and years of birth and death, offering no hint that beneath simple stone rested someone who had altered intelligence history through courage exercised in silence, her greatest achievement being that she had lived and died without seeking recognition for service that had saved countless lives through patient observation of bread and refugees in a divided city where walls separated more than geography. Decades later, when archives finally opened and historians pieced together fragmented records of Cold War espionage operations, Sister Margareta's story emerged like morning light penetrating fog, revealing a narrative so remarkable that initial reports faced skepticism from scholars, conditioned to dismiss extraordinary individual contributions in favor of institutional narratives and bureaucratic explanations. The bread-marked intelligence maps preserved in protective sleeves became artifacts studied by intelligence professionals and academics alike, her methodology taught in courses on improvised tradecraft and single-agent operations conducted under impossible circumstances without support infrastructure or extraction possibilities. The Benedictine convent where she had served received historical designation markers in reunified Berlin, though the plaques mentioned only that the location had played roles in Cold War intelligence activities without specifying details that might compromise operational methods still considered sensitive by security services. Her photograph, a single grainy image taken during a convent celebration in 1963, appeared in books and documentaries, her serene expression and simple habit, revealing nothing of the remarkable mind and courageous heart that had operated. Behind that humble exterior, during years when the world balanced on nuclear precipice, the legacy Sister Margareta left extended beyond intelligence victories and dismantled networks into something more profound about human capacity for courage in ordinary circumstances, about the reality that history's pivotal moments often turn on actions taken by unexpected people in unlikely places who serve without seeking glory or acknowledgement. Young intelligence officers studying her case files decades after her death learned lessons about patience, observation, and the power of genuine cover provided by authentic faith and humble service that no amount of training could fully replicate. The convent kitchen where she had worked was preserved as part of Cold War museum installations, visitors standing in spaces where she had marked bread loaves and catalogued Soviet operatives while maintaining perfect cover through genuine devotion to spiritual calling that had been no deception, but rather the foundation supporting everything else. Her Story became testament to the truth that the most effective warriors sometimes wear habits instead of uniforms, fight battles with bread instead of bullets, and achieve victories measured not in territory conquered, but in dangers quietly prevented through sacrifices the world would never fully comprehend or adequately honor. What secrets might still remain hidden in places we consider ordinary and unremarkable, waiting for history to reveal their significance? Subscribe to uncover more untold stories from the shadows of history.